I'm Sasha Ilenko, co-writer and producer on the Reconnect America podcast. This is Rail Bites, where we highlight some of the gems of what we are learning from our guests on the main show. So, we recently published the third episode of our main Reconnect America series. These are our longer documentary-style episodes. They feature multiple guests, and each episode forms a core piece of the larger curriculum that we are trying to build around U.S. rail transport and its potential to help solve some of our most urgent problems. If you haven't already listened to episode 3, I highly recommend you check it out. We talk about why creating Amtrak was seen as the most desirable way to rescue the failing railroad corporations in 1970, about the decision to give Amtrak a mandate to turn a profit on passenger service, and the consequences that this mandate had for communities who lost service as Amtrak tried to cut down on its costs. We also explored how the decision to keep rail infrastructure under private ownership has posed a major obstacle for Amtrak service. Despite legal provisions that are supposed to guarantee access and priority on the tracks to passenger trains, the corporate freight railroads that host Amtrak fail to honor these statutes. So Amtrak struggles to add new routes and to expand the frequency of its service, while its existing trains face horrendous delays because they are frequently stuck behind freight trains. There are a lot of perspectives out there on what lies at the root of this problem and what should be done about it. Some people emphasize the freight railroads' deliberate dismantling of their track infrastructure over the past 50 years, as they have shifted toward running fewer, longer trains between a small handful of cities and ports, leaving fewer spots for faster passenger trains to pass by slower freight trains. Others point to the almost complete lack of enforcement of Amtrak's preference provisions over the years. They argue that the freight railroads are able to give Amtrak trains access and preference on their tracks, but that without enforcement, they just have no incentive to do so. It's entirely possible that both of these factors are at least partially responsible for the problem. And today's guest believes that there is also a third element that often gets overlooked, namely dispatching. Dispatching is the art of managing the flow of trains on a railroad right-of-way. And Tom White is something of an expert on it. On top of decades of experience actually doing it and overseeing it, Tom has literally written a textbook on train dispatching. As you will hear, he was also hired by Congress, Amtrak, and a BNSF to investigate delays to passenger trains. What he found was a sharp drop in the quality of railroad dispatching over time, threatening, if not virtually extinguishing, a tradition of excellence that was built and preserved over the course of generations. The solution, Tom says, is not to punish the railroads for failing to do something they no longer know how to do, but rather to require them to invest in rebuilding that knowledge base and passing it on to each new generation of dispatchers. In the clip, you'll hear Tom address his comments to Bill. As you probably know, that's Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer. This clip was drawn from a conversation between these two longtime collaborators.
Congress actually looked into the delays on the Cascades and the Coast Starlight because it was pretty horrendous. And it's funny, I was hired as a process of this investigation by Congress. I wound up with WashDOT, Amtrak, and BNSF all hiring me separately to look into the causes. And most of what I found was, I won't be as unkind as say incompetence, but a lack of knowledge. Not even a lack of effort. The lack of effort came from the lack of knowledge. So I'm going to try to create a situation that can be visualized. When you're a train dispatcher, the person who manages the traffic, it's like playing chess, and you have to look several moves in advance because just like the chessboard, you have pieces that can move one diagonally or one up and down or two over and one across and things like that. Well, the different speeds of trains work that way. So when you're planning on making a chess move, you have to look at all the opponent's pieces and figure out what movements are possible with all of his pieces and what are likely. So let's say that I have an eastbound and a westbound freight train, and they're someplace between Wenatchee and Spokane. And the eastbound and westbound freight train, the dispatcher just lets them go along until they reach the point where one of them needs to take siding because of the fact that there's no more track in between them. So the two freight trains meet at, let's say, Wilson Creek. The passenger train is moving way faster than the freight trains. So when you go along and you look at the two freight trains and you figure out, oh, they're going to find each other at Wilson Creek, you needed to know 30 minutes ago that the passenger train was going to be at Wilson Creek at the same time as the two freight trains would, so that you could then change your move and have not both freight trains at Wilson Creek at the same time. That doesn't occur. So a lot of it is because the dispatcher lost the chess game by not planning the moves ahead. Why did that occur? Because they're not taught that. In your 28 weeks, Bill, when you go from doing what you're doing to being in charge of a railroad, you will learn the rules that it takes to do it safely. Will you learn how to not have Amtrak and two freight trains show up at Wilson Creek at the same time? No, you won't learn that because that's not in the 28 weeks. I've considered developing an online course in railroad operations for many years, but we have the problem of the railroad industry doesn't really care for the knowledge. It's useless to them. So why should they pay for it? Why would a person pay for a course that wouldn't get them a job? When you want to be an air traffic controller, FAA requires, before you're even considered, that you have passed a 2-year certificate program at an FAA authorized aviation course in a couple of specific junior colleges. After that, you are then brought into FAA for training, which could be several years of training before you're turned loose. In the US, they care so little about how people manage the assets that you yourself, Bill, could be a train dispatcher running a railroad in 28 weeks. I participated in a joint EU and US Department of Education study in the differences in advanced higher learning in the railroad industry. And it makes us look really pathetic. So in Germany, for example, if you want to be a conductor or an engineer on a train, you take 3 years of dedicated trade school in that profession. Railroad management is a 4-year dedicated program in railroad operations and engineering and management. From there, you can go on to an advanced degree in some specific area of railroad operations. And I know many people in Europe who are PhDs specifically in railroad operations. We need that level here. So the quandary is, if the industry doesn't want it, who's going to pay to take the courses? Therefore, who's going to offer the courses? So I think what it's going to take is actually some type of regulation to require knowledge and a regulation to offer the knowledge and some higher standards. The Federal Railroad Administration has a licensing procedure for conductors, engineers, and now train dispatchers. But it doesn't hold a candle to the knowledge that's required in other countries. Basically, the FRA is interested in people who can pass the safety rules. And if train delays occur as a result of the lack of knowledge in how to avoid delaying trains, so be it, as long as you're qualified on the safety rules. So we need a lot higher standards for the people who are actually operating the railroad in the knowledge of how to operate the railroad. Unfortunately, in the US, the people who make the money are a lot less important than the people who count the money.
That was railroad industry veteran and author Tom White. Thank you to Oda Proda for the theme music. If you like what you heard in this Rail Bite and think more people should hear it, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. You can also support this work by pitching in and getting involved at solutionaryrail.org.